Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our President of the United Cities and Local Governments in Africa, Mayor Khalifa Sall, and thank you for the kind words. Honorable ministers, mayors, and delegates present. I think as we go to Latin America later, in fact next month, both for the Conference of the United Cities and Local Governments, and as the world meets in Quito, the role of cities is being placed at the forefront of the development agenda. And this, I believe, is correctly so, particularly for our cities in the global south, and in particular for our cities on the African continent. The past few years have experienced the emergence of what seems to be a consensus on the role of cities, whether it's defined in the Sustainable Development Goals, the majority of which speaks of the role and functions of cities, or whether it's in the agenda on financing for development, or in the Paris Action Agenda on climate change. The role of cities is emerging as critical in the development space. And no doubt the new urban agenda would consolidate the role of our cities and what they should be able to do. And this is particularly so as our cities continue to confront some critical challenges, least of which would be the challenge of underdevelopment. It would include the reality of lack of access to adequate services, including water, sanitation, electricity, transportation, and other forms of mobility for our citizens and residents, and indeed spatial planning and spatial form in our cities. Our cities continue to experience high levels of urbanization, with these levels of urbanization placing additional pressure on our respective mayors and city governments in terms of their ability to extend services, not only to the residents that currently live in those cities, but also to the new people that come into the cities. Some of our experiences in the South African context include the reality that whilst you continue developing housing opportunities for people in the cities, that in fact you're dealing with an ongoing and moving target. That our reality is that, for example, in Johannesburg, we experience an influx or inflow of about 10,000 people every month. So whilst you're able to develop over a period of time 30,000 housing units in a period of 5 years, the reality is that the actual backlog increases as opposed to decreases. So the city could be the leading city in terms of providing housing opportunities, but continues to experience challenges with regards to human settlement development. And this manifests in a situation where there's a growth of slum and informal settlement developments, but also a phenomenon that we don't always track as city governments, including backyard rental accommodation, where people extend their homes to new people that settle in their cities as means of tenure and access to housing opportunities. So they rent out their backyards to accommodate people. This, of course, is a means of income to those people themselves, but also a means of accommodation for those that come into our cities. There's also the growth of informal settlements and the growth of slums, particularly in our inner cities. One of the key challenges that presents is also the reality in the context of South Africa, where cities were planned for exclusion and segregation, that many of those that come into the cities locate themselves in the outskirts, very far away from where the amenities in the urban context are. So spatially excluding themselves in an environment where cities were designed to exclude them in any case. And for us, over the past few years, there are some critical issues that have emerged as lessons, but also some critical issues that we think, and I think, should constitute part of what is the new urban agenda, and the role of cities in that regard. The first, I believe, is that it is important that we allow our cities to have a critical role in spatial planning and development, so that our city governments have the ability to plan to confront their challenges, to develop the spatial frameworks necessary, and to define how space interacts with the city. For indeed, whilst we continue to experience situations of informalization, even in the context of informalization, there should be a degree of spatial planning and a framework that's developed that would enable cities to be able to intervene in a particular way. The second, I think, is about ensuring that our cities have adequate financing and institutional capacity to be able to confront the development challenges that they need to deal with. And this would include fiscal decentralization within the context of our own governments and the ability created for cities to be able to generate revenue, to be able to raise loans, to be able to access financing mechanisms so that they are able to confront their challenges. For indeed, you cannot just plan without the ability to develop. But if you've got the fiscal instruments at your disposal, it gives you greater opportunity to be able to respond to the challenges that our cities confront. That notwithstanding, in our experience in the South African context, is that particularly our large metropolitan municipalities have fiscal responsibility. They have the capacity and capability to raise their own revenues. They also have the capacity and capability to raise bonds and loans and different financial instruments in the debt capital market. That, no doubt, is not adequate within the context of the challenges that we confront. So we need to find ways through the United Nations systems and development financing agencies and institutions to extend fiscal support and institutional support to our municipalities. I'm saying this because our experience is that whilst we've been able to do the things that we do in the context of South African cities, it is clear and evident that we need to raise additional resources. And agencies such as the Global Environment Facility have begun to extend facilities to our municipalities, with Johannesburg getting the first tranche of $8 million as part of its corridor development program. This is the first tranche of what we believe would be many tranches that could be extended to the municipality, but that would need other agencies to come to the party to ensure that the municipalities have the institutional and financial capacity to be able to develop. The third and critical aspect is the role of cities with regards to infrastructure development. It remains crucial that when you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, in many ways, you're also talking about extending municipal utilities to people. It's about extending water, sanitation, electricity, human settlement development opportunities, mobility opportunities, the ability to deal with, mitigate, and manage climate change, waste management, and a whole range of functions that municipalities play. So it would be important that our municipalities are extended the responsibility to develop infrastructure and to have the ability to introduce innovative solutions to our infrastructure development programs, including in certain instances the development of microgrids where you do not have access to the mainstream grid in terms of access to electricity, but also similar solutions in sanitation and so on. And lastly, I believe that urban mobility is critical for the ability of urban residents to access their city and the amenities provided by cities. So it is crucial that we enable and facilitate that our cities create access to mobility and different forms of mobility to their residents, so that people have access to their city. But in certain instances, it would also require that we rethink the way in which we engage with mobility in an urban context. For in cities where the poor live in the outskirts, and our international mobility systems incentivize people to live closer to where they are, maybe we need to even rethink the way in which we subsidize our urban transport systems so that mobility becomes a means of access to the city. For in many instances, the poor do not have a choice, because it is only in instances where you have a choice of location where we can disincentivize you from living in the outskirts, in suburbia, so to say. But in instances where you live in the outskirts as a result of historic policies in the South African context, or simply as a result of the reality that it is easier to locate yourself there because you cannot occupy land in the urban center. People tend to occupy in informal settlements in the outskirts. We need to create access to the urban core and the urban amenity through mobility. And I think that these are some of the critical issues that would need to present as part of the implementation of the new urban agenda and the role of our cities going forward, in particular for our cities in the global south and our cities on the African continent. Thank you very much.